Okay, so this is going to be video on fourth chapter of On Liberty, the authority of society and the individual. So at this point, Mill has given an introduction to his whole view, chapter 1. Chapter 2, he's focused specifically on liberty of thought and discussion. And then in chapter 3, what he did was he provided an account of why it's good to let people sort of live their own life, what the benefit of it is. Remember, the reason he has to do that is he's a utilitarian. A utilitarian, if he's going to justify rights, is going to have to make appeal to the beneficial consequences of people having those rights. And so the chapter on individuality is supposed to show you why it's good for the individual and for society for people to be allowed to make their own decisions about how to live their life, right? What to do. Chapter 4 is supposed to show where the dividing line is between what the individual should have authority over and what society should have authority over. And the fundamental principle is what's come to be known as the harm principle. I'm going to erase that and make it a little bigger. The idea that Mill has is that in the aspects of your behavior, how you live your life, that affect only you, no one should interfere with you. You should be able to do basically whatever you want. But only in the area where it doesn't have an impact on other people. Now, put this way, the harm principle, in fact, let me write this version of it down. All right, there. So, society may only interfere with individuals when their behavior impacts others. Put this way, the harm principle, well, for one thing, it's not clear why it's called the harm principle when it's put this way, but you can fairly, obviously attribute to Mill that the impacts have to be negative impacts, right? But in order for society to interfere with you, you have to be negatively impacting other people. Put this way, the harm principle is basically useless. Think of it, and to see why I think of it the following way. Society is only going to interfere with behavior it knows about. Right? Other people are only going to get up in your business if they know what you're doing. Right? If you're doing something atypical, if you're practicing a religion other people don't practice, if you're into weird stuff, right, that you do inside your own house, stuff like that, there's only going to be an issue of people interfering with you to get you to stop if they know that you're doing it. If they don't know you're doing it, they're not going to attempt to interfere. They're going to assume you're normal because most people are. That's what normal is. Right? It's just whatever happens to be the most common thing at the time. So, the harm principle, if it's going to provide any reason for people to not interfere with you, is going to have to provide reason to not interfere with you in cases where they know about what you're doing. I mean, otherwise you wouldn't need the harm principles. You'd be fine because your secrets are still secret or whatever. But of course, if someone knows about what you're doing, then it's having some kind of impact on them. Right? You've done something that's led to them having evidence about what you're doing, which means you've altered the kind of information they have available to them. They've seen you do it. They've heard you do it. They found out from other people that you're doing it. And this is a kind of impact, right? And Mill realizes this. He understands that sort of the way he initially puts this principle is maybe not the most perspicuous. It's not the most helpful, right? Because he goes on to make it a little more precise. Not as precise as he could have. It's unfortunate, given that chapter 4 is sort of the linchpin of the whole work, that he's very vague here. But the point is, for this to be a liberal principle, a principle that justifies granting people or honoring or recognizing people's individual liberties, it's going to have to protect a lot more than just those actions of yours that literally have zero impact on others. And so we're going to have to make the harm principle stronger. And the way to make it stronger is to bring in the concept of rights. Right? So it's not just going to be when your behavior impacts others. It's going to be when their behavior violates the rights of others. Mill makes this clear that this has to be something a little bit different than just impacting, when he points out that anything someone does might cause someone else offense. And he says offense can never be a legitimate basis for society interfering with the individual. And I'll have a little bit more to say about how precise he makes that idea of society interfering with the individual a little more precise, which is good because, as stated, the harm principle is bizarre. But he restricts it in this following way. Right? It's not just any impact. It's an impact that involves the violation of the rights of others. Or it might even be better to say it impacts them in areas where they have a right to certain things from you. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit, especially given that Mill is utilitarian, right? So a utilitarian, if they're going to have a concept of rights, are going to have a concept of rights that's ultimately justified by the beneficial consequences of those rights. Now, that makes things especially tricky for Mill here, because what he most wants to prevent is one person or a group of people interfering with the lives of some individual, or life of some individual, for that individual's own good. What Mill thinks is when the real basis of someone trying to get you to stop doing something, somebody pressuring you, or somebody trying to force you to change, is that the change is going to benefit you, the person being forced to alter your behavior. Mill wants that out. Right? That's called paternalism. Right? Paternalism is coercion for a person's own good. Now, because we live in society, right? Because we're not loners living out on our own in the state of nature. Mill throws some shade at the whole social contract state of nature idea at the very beginning of this chapter when he says society is not a contract and there's no good reason to treat it like it is. So not only is he going after conservatives in this book, as he did in chapter 3, he's also going after the social contract tradition. He just thinks this is silly, right? Society did not form by people voluntarily coming together from some pre-societal state of nature, and it's not worth talking about it as though it were true. Right? So Mill not only thinks the historical speculations of people like Locke and Rousseau are silly, which they were. He also doesn't buy into the far more plausible idea that treating society as though it were a contract is right. He doesn't give much of an explanation of that position, so I'm not going to spend much more time on it. But because we do live in a society, we have to coerce each other all the time, right? Every law is a kind of coercion, at least potentially, because it's a threat. A law is a threat the state makes towards you in order to change your behavior. Because we don't want people to break the law, right? The whole reason we punish them for it is we don't want them to do that stuff. And that's a threat, right? It's a coercive threat. Now, what a liberal accepts, right, and this is what sets a liberal apart from like an anarchist, is that because we live together, some kinds of coercion are okay. Right? Just coercing people by itself isn't wrong. It depends on why you do it. And a liberal is going to be someone who says you can coerce others in order to make them behave properly to other people in order to make them behave properly socially, right? In order to get them to respect the rights of others. But you can't coerce people just to make them better off. Right? Now, this view that you can do that, right, or this activity of coercing people for their own good is called paternalism, because the idea is that it's like what your parents do towards you. Why isn't it called parentalism? Well, because, back in the 1800s, it was dads who were in charge. So they called it paternalism. That's paternal. Right? The idea is it's only appropriate, and Mill says this in this chapter, for children to be coerced into doing things for their own good. Why? Because children don't have the capacity to sort of make their own decisions. Now, Mill briefly considers what to do about adults who seem to not be able to make their own decisions. And he does not care for this idea. His basic point here, and it's a point that he makes in previous chapters too, is that once you're an adult and living your life, the person best able to figure out what's in your best interest, the person in the best position to know what's good for you is you. Now, he's not going to say this is universally the case. After all, like, how could it be? Someone who's addicted to heroin and not trying to quit is not doing what's best for them. They might say they are, they just don't know. But most of the time it will be. And here's a key point. The way that Mill's going to justify rights is not going to involve saying, in every case, respecting someone's rights will have the best consequences in that case. You think about the heroin addict, right? Mill's going to want to say the heroin addict should be allowed to, shoot up heroin. He's going to have some restrictions on that. Like if you have duties to other people you're not fulfilling because you're, taking the heroin, well, that's different, right? Because then you're violating someone's rights by not performing your duties towards them. So, for example, if you're a parent and you're shooting up heroin, Mill pretty clearly thinks, well, then the state and society can step in and get you to stop shooting up heroin. But let's say you're an adult, you're single, right? You don't have any obligations that you're failing to meet because you're shooting up heroin. Mill wants to say you should be allowed to do that, right? And further, the state shouldn't be able to come in and make you stop shooting up heroin for your own good. And other people shouldn't be trying to force you either. Now, given that he's a utilitarian, right, that the standard of morality is just, do the thing that has the best consequences, you might think, well, in the case of the heroin addict, wouldn't the best consequences come from stopping them from doing what they're doing? And Mill would probably admit, in a particular case, yes. But what Mill thinks is, when we're talking about how society is structured, we have to have rules that govern the cases in general, right? That govern all the types of situations that come up. And you can't have social rules that are really super complex, right? So imagine you started out with a rule that said basically what Mill wants it to say, which is that coercive force can be brought to bear on individuals only to make them respect the rights of others, never in order to make them change their behavior for their own good. And then let's say you've got that general social rule, and then let's say you add a clause to it. You say, well, except for when they're heroin addicts. Right? And then maybe you add another clause later on when somebody brings up, like, but what about people who join cults? That's bad for you, isn't it? Joining a cult. Right? You're like, okay, all right, yeah, except also for cults. Right? And someone says, what if it's not a cult? What if it's just like a really dumb religion? And I know we all tend to think that, all religions are equal. Religions are not equal. Let's be serious about it. There are versions of great religions that are stupid, right? They're just dumb. There are some religions just entirely dumb. Scientology, for example, was created by a science fiction writer whose books weren't selling, so he just turned his books into a religion. If you're a Scientologist listening to this video and this hurts your feelings, okay. But let's say you add in, all right, if they're in a cult or Scientology. Now, is Scientology a cult? Maybe, maybe not. Cult's an imprecise word, right? It's certainly like bigger and longer lasting than most cults, right? And, we haven't found all the Scientologists dead of suicide in like a barn or something, the way cults sometimes go. So, maybe they're not a cult, but they're a weird religion who believes a lot of weird things that are pretty clearly made up just so that the guy who made up the religion can make money. Right? All right, so now we've got that in. Heroin, cult, Scientology, what else? Well, what if they just believe really stupid things? Like right now, it's the 14th of November, 2020, and there's a lot of people online who are just sure that Donald Trump is going to be reelected president because, millions of votes have been cast illegally for Joe Biden. And these people are delusional, and they're sending their money into a legal defense fund that, if you read the fine print, if you give less than $8,000, most of that money doesn't go towards the legal defense fund at all. It goes towards a super PAC that Donald Trump runs. It's a scam. You might think, well, what about when people are being scammed because they lack the critical thinking skills to avoid the scam? Well, now we're interfering with people who make bad decisions with their money because of scams. Now what about when people just make bad financial decisions? Do we step in when people make bad financial decisions and make their financial decisions for them? And you start getting, instead of that nice simple rule that people could follow, that people could build their lives around, right? Because this is an important thing about rules. Social rules set the expectations we have for how society is going to work so we can make a plan for our life. Mill talks about forming people's expectations. Right? When you're, in your 20s and you're planning your life, you want to know that there are certain things that are or are not going to happen, right? There's no reason for you to save a lot of money if you think periodically society might just seize everyone's savings. But, if you can't save any money, you can't save up to buy a house. You can't save up to do all sorts of things that you might want to do when you're 40 or 50 or something like that. We need social rules that are simple enough that everyone can follow them. And so the more exceptions we put into these social rules, the harder it is for everyone to follow them, harder it is even for everyone to know what they are. So we need simple rules that cover a lot of cases. We can't have a different rule for every case, which means in some cases, even if we know for sure that interfering with someone for their own good will actually lead to their benefit, like when we make the heroin addicts stop shooting up heroin, Mill's going to have a set of principles that say, okay, don't do that. Why? Well, not because you won't actually do good here, but we need to all abide by the same set of rules. And if we allow it here, right, if we get rid of the simple rule that we can all follow, which is when it just concerns themselves, leave people alone, well, then we're going to start getting into territory where we're not letting people make investments that they want to make but that we think are bad. And then it's really getting fishy, right? But it wasn't that, it was like a slippery slope. Right? Now, slippery slope is usually not a good way to argue, but the idea is just that it gets hard to tell where you should stop when it comes to interfering with people for their own good, but eventually you do get to clear cases where you ought to stop. It is not everyone's job to go make sure that no one makes any bad financial decisions, right? People need to make their own decisions. They need to live with the consequences, but they need to make their own decisions. This is Mill's thought anyway. So paternalism is out because usually it doesn't work. Mill wants to be clear about that. Usually the person in the best position to know what's good for them is them. But even in the cases where it's pretty clear they don't know what's good for them, even then Mill thinks we should refrain as long as their behavior isn't hurting someone else, isn't violating someone else's rights. Right? So the harm principle says society may only interfere with individuals when their behavior violates the rights of others. Now, when do people have rights? This is not something Mill makes altogether clear in this book, but to supplement this book with another book that he wrote called On Utilitarianism, Mill there says that people have rights to do something. So let's say X has a right to Y when society ought to protect or support X's authority over Y. And the form that protection or support takes, in particular, is punishing people who violate the right. So, when do people have rights? Well, people have a right to do something. Let's take a concrete example. I have a right to this book. Here's my copy of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. This is my book. I own it. I bought it. Actually, I don't know if I bought it. I think I might have got this for free because I taught it at some point. Let's use my phone, right? There's my phone. And I own this phone. I bought it. And I have a right to it. Now, what does that mean for Mill? For Mill, what that means is society ought to punish someone who takes this from me. That's all a right is. Society ought to impose what he called sanctions or punishments on people who took from me my control over this thing I have a right to. I have a right to privacy in my home, means I have the right to decide who can observe the things going on in my home, right? Which means that society ought to punish people who go against that, people who snoop into my home without my permission. Now, when ought society to do this? Well, when the best policy for society is to do it. And it's the best policy for society to do it when it will lead to overall greater happiness. So this is how it all ties back into utilitarianism, this secular basis for liberalism. So you have a right to something. When it's the case, it's a society ought to protect it, right? Ought to protect your control of that area, your authority over that area, which means it will make people happier if the government has a general policy of punishing people who violate that authority or that control that you're supposed to have over something. Okay. So Mill, for example, if you were to talk about private property rights, is not going to justify private property rights by saying God gave the world to everyone. No. Mill will say the best kind of economy, the economy that will lead to the most sort of economic prosperity, is one that has private property rights, is one where the government steps in and punishes those who takes things, or punishes those people who take things that don't belong to them, right? Who punish people who intrude upon land that someone else is cultivating, who punish people for taking something produced by someone's own labor, right? It's not God, it's just the fact that society is going to work better in the long run overall if the government and other social institutions do this. Right? So your right to something is a matter of it being a good idea from a utilitarian perspective for the government to use coercive force to protect you in that area. Okay. So the harm principle just sort of follows from what a right is. The government ought to use coercive force to protect your rights. And Mill's saying, in addition, they should only use coercive force to protect your rights, to protect the rights of individuals, which means your behavior can only have coercive force applied to it if it is negatively impacting someone else's rights. Right? If someone has a right to something or to a right for you to behave in a certain way, then the government can punish you for not doing whatever it is you were supposed to do, or the government can punish you for doing the thing you weren't supposed to do, right? So to again make this more concrete, because so far this has been pretty abstract, let's say I wake up every morning at 4 a.m. and I go outside and I just start honking my horn really loudly, right? Or I play music really, really loudly at 4 a.m., waking up everyone in my neighborhood. Now, given that it's 4 a.m., you might think people have a reasonable expectation that they're going to be allowed to sleep normal human hours. Sleeping normal human hours means you're asleep at 4 a.m. I say that, and it's 3:49 a.m. while I'm recording this. And so it would probably be a good idea for society to protect people's ability to sleep at normal human times, which means it's appropriate for society to punish me for honking my horn loudly at 4 a.m. or playing my music loudly at 4 a.m. Whereas it wouldn't be the case, right, at 4 p.m. if I played my music loudly. Because it's not as important for society to protect the sort of neighborhood quiet at 4 p.m. as it is 4 a.m. because at 4 a.m. most people are sleeping and at 4 p.m. most people aren't. To get an even clearer case, right? If I want to sort of like do weird dancing with my arms or something like that, just walk around the neighborhood going like this, right? Little punching motions. That's fine until somebody's standing right where I'm punching. There's a phrase that goes, my rights stop where your nose begins or your face begins, right? I have a right to make a punching motion as long as your face isn't there. Because people ought to be protected in their personal safety, which means that it's a good idea for the government to punish people who violate the personal safety of others. So, if that's the principle, then anything you do that doesn't violate someone's rights, you ought not to be interfered with on account of. Now, what does that mean, interfered with? Mill wants to draw a distinction that he hasn't drawn prior to this in the book. And it's a distinction between just having a negative opinion of someone and then actively trying to harm them or trying to coerce them or interfere with them. Here's what he points out. There's lots of things that we just find disgusting or distasteful. And I'm going to use a pretty horrible example here that I came up with, and I felt bad about it, but it actually is the kind of thing I've run into before. I once had a job stocking shelves. I've actually had this job like 3 different times. Stocking shelves overnight at grocery stores. And I would do it for like a summer here or there, right? I did it in grad school a little while. I did it in college. I did it once after grad school when I had a PhD, but I was still stocking shelves because I hadn't gotten a job as a professor yet. Anyway, you meet in this kind of situation some people who are doing it like you for just a little while, and then you meet some people who've been doing it for decades, right? And this is their career. Stocking shelves overnight is their career. And some of them are just hard luck cases, right? They had a tough time of it, and life just hasn't worked out for them. And then some of them are just like bizarre people, sometimes in quirky ways that are fun, and sometimes in deeply disturbing ways. So here's the example I'm using, and I bring up that context to let you know where I heard this. Suppose you knew of someone who spoke often and loudly about how attractive they found movie stars who were under the age of 18. And they downloaded pictures of them in scantily clad pictures. Nothing illegal, right? Nothing like, not pornography, because if they're under 18, pornography there is illegal. But just still creepy, right? Not breaking any laws, right? These images are images that the movie star or music performer has allowed to come out, right? If they're a musical performer, maybe it's their music videos. If they're a movie star, it's a picture from their movies. And so it's perfectly legal, not only for those pictures to exist, but for this person to have those pictures. But they talk all the time about how attracted they are to these people. Here's the thing. Mill's going to say, as long as they're not violating anyone's rights, the state shouldn't come down on this person. Right? It's not like this person should go to jail or pay a fine. And you shouldn't try to coerce via a non-legal means this person into stopping. Right? For example, you shouldn't try to get this person fired. you shouldn't, if you hear a coworker, and I basically heard coworkers talking about this kind of stuff, and I was like, guys, this is just repulsive. But I should not, and I didn't, have tried to get them fired. Why? Well, because that's imposing such a significant cost on them that it's basically like coercing them, right? If I take that job away from them, given that the guy I'm talking about, I don't know if he's still alive, it was a while ago, but he had been working as a overnight shelf stocker at the same store for like 15 years. If he loses this job, he probably doesn't have any other prospects, because if he had any other prospects, he wouldn't have stuck with that job for 15 years. This was not a high paying job, right? This guy was barely making above minimum wage for over a decade. If I take that job from him, if I, go to human resources and I say, this guy's making me uncomfortable, I'd like for you to fire him, and I get him fired, that's such a significant cost that it's basically like if I went and just like beat him up, or if I threatened him with a gun or something like that. This guy might lose, his home. He might lose, he might die. Who knows? He might end up homeless and die. And if he's not violating anyone's rights, it's not appropriate for me to do that, nor is it even appropriate for me to threaten to do that. That said, this guy's disgusting. Right? This guy is a repulsive human being by almost anyone's standards, certainly my own. What Mill says is, obviously, you don't have to act like you're not disgusted by him. Right? If you're disgusted by the person, you get to be disgusted, which means you don't have to be friends with them. You don't have to invite them over to your place. You can invite some of your coworkers, but not them, to go to like a party at your house. You can exclude them from your social circle, but not in a way that's designed to threaten them into changing their behavior. Right? And this can be a very difficult line to draw. Right? And it goes to the heart of a tension within liberalism. And the tension is that if we're going to go beyond just looking at what the state does, and we're going to start looking at what society does, right? So a lot of concerns that people have about free speech they don't have anything to do with what the government says or does, right? When people complain about free speech on Facebook or Twitter, that has nothing to do with the state. That's a private corporation. You're using their services, and their claim is, as a private corporation, they get to decide who uses their services and who doesn't. If they want to ban you, they can ban you. But if you're a liberal concerned with freedom of expression, you're going to be concerned with it, right? And because you're concerned with more than just what the state does. You're concerned with what private individuals do. But of course, you can't tell private individuals that they're never allowed to treat some people better than others on account of their behavior. Precisely because people have freedom to associate with who they want to associate with, right? I have the right to not associate with the weirdo pervert who, worked down the shelf from me stocking cans of soup, right? Because he was talking about his weirdo pervert things, right? I get to exclude him from my social circle. If I were prevented from doing that, that would be a violation of my freedoms, my ability to decide who I associate with. But Mill says, if we go too far in the direction of honoring people's freedom of association, we can get to this point where, maybe I then go to everyone else, all of our coworkers, and I say, all right, we're never going to talk to this guy again. We're going to not even acknowledge his existence. We're going to break him down psychologically. He's going to say hi when he comes into work, and we're going to act like he's not there. Is that freedom of association? Yeah, but Mill says at that point, you're not just choosing who you're going to be friends with. You're actively trying to hurt someone. And why else would you be trying to hurt them if not because of their behavior that you don't like? And so Mill says there is a difference between natural expressions of distaste and attempts to coerce people socially. And you shouldn't coerce people socially. You certainly shouldn't coerce them through governmental means when their behavior concerns only them, meaning when their behavior doesn't violate anyone else's rights. Where rights, again, are those areas of your life that government protects your authority over, because doing so is better for everyone overall in the long run. Okay? So that is Mill's defense of the harm principle. The harm principle, which is at the heart of liberty, he thinks. If you're not hurting anyone else, you should be left alone. Where hurting anyone else, hurting other people, involves violating their rights. And rights are those things that society protects your enjoyment of, because it's better for everyone overall. Okay. Now, the final chapter of the book is Mill applying this principle to various issues that were sort of live political and social issues at the time he was writing this. And that'll be for the next video.